Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Thursday, July 4th, actual July 4th, 2019, live show today for Independence Day, and, of course, to mark the recent death of Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. Whatever, I'm still sticking with that. There's no reason to believe otherwise. Hasn't appeared in public, hasn't been quoted in a newspaper anywhere. For those of you sticking to the milder version that he has simply had some sort of health episode, from which he is totally recovered, well, good luck to you. Hope it works out for you. Twitter aflame this morning with his apparent misstatement that Aircraft One, or the world-famous Aircraft One, would be flying over the crowd today for the Independence Day celebrations. Of course, everyone laughing, but technically he's right. It is not Air Force One. It's not designated Air Force One unless the president is alive and on board, and that's not happening no matter what. So, well, I guess unless they put Pence up there. Although I haven't seen Pence take the oath of office. I figure they're keeping him on ice for now so that they can get away with their play in the census case. That's the biggest news, I guess, over the last 24 hours. Everyone who has been telling us all along that no, things aren't quite as bad as you thought, because at the very least, Trump has shown no inclination to simply straight up defy a court's order yet. But I guess that's coming. Although there's a technical argument to be made, and there are several, some worse than others. And of course, the Trump administration is making the worst one possible. But yes, what happened yesterday and something that happened over the last 24 hours for us to examine. The court below, that is the federal district court, that was that had the task of considering the various lawsuits, or at least two of the various lawsuits, seeking to short-circuit the process, or short-circuit the short-circuiting of the process, depending on how you look at it, and block the citizenship question from being added to the census, got its, they have had their ruling from the Supreme Court, which technically didn't rule directly necessarily on the merits of including the question, but instead put it to them that the administration had not made a sufficient or consistent or coherent case for including the question. And so it was being remanded down below, and that basically, though, that for the time being, with the printing deadline allegedly having come and gone, actually, for the deadline for beginning the print run and finalizing the wording of the questionnaires has come and gone. This according to the administration and the representations they made in court. Maybe we can talk to Armando a little bit about it later on if he's free and not blowing things up yet. But at any rate, they had to have a conference by phone because they couldn't get all the parties together. The judge wanted to know what's the status of things going forward. And right there and then during the call, the lawyers representing the administration had to admit to the judge, we were caught by surprise. We spoke the other day and said that's pretty much it. The Supreme Court has spoken, and so we're going to be dropping the question and dropping the questions about the question and going ahead with printing the questionnaire forms as agreed, beginning July 1st or thereabouts, without the citizenship question included. And I just kind of got word that that is not actually what's happening, and that we've been ordered by the President of the United States, who is now dead, to go ahead with fighting the legal battle out and finding a way to legally, or maybe illegally, include the citizenship question on the questionnaire. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning.
You get a little bit of pollen in the air over there.
Yeah, well, I can't help it. I'm snorting my coffee over this. I'm very happy that you cleared up one of my big questions. I wasn't sure which circuit court did this, but as you pointed out, it was the short circuit.
Yes, right. That's the easiest one to get together at a moment's notice. Yeah, I think it was actually the federal district court in Maryland that was dealing with this. Has been remanded all the way back down, I guess, or not even remanded. Apparently, there was. This is interesting. This is a really bad case, and because it will allow people to hem and haw for longer about whether or not this is really a constitutional crisis after all, which means I think we're on for exactly the crisis that we had categorically ruled out the other day, that the question was dead and there was just simply no legal opportunity to bring the thing back. But that was based on a lie.
We'll talk about that and politics. And yeah, if Armando's around, that'd be great. It is a holiday after all. While we're here, that's another story altogether.
Yes,
we're crazy.
I do not know.
But, I do need a lawyer to help explain this to me because I'm not a lawyer. But as I understand it, this is a court that actually had the question come up because it was trying to deal with the fact that the new information from the Republican operative, who clearly was trying to get this question addressed on the census because it was going to help white Republicans win. And that information,
he's definitely dead, that guy,
which came from thumb drives provided by the deceased operative's daughter, estranged daughter, came to light after some of this stuff had already happened. And I thought that Robert's order remanded it back to this court. So this is the court that actually is active in terms of trying to figure out what to do. And they thought everything was settled and therefore it would be, not under discussion. Then Trump tweeted, and one of the judges who's involved here said, well, I read Trump's tweet, so what the heck does this mean?
Right.
So had this emergency call with the lawyers on both sides and said, explain to me what's going on. And in fact, you have by Friday afternoon to tell me either that it's settled like you said it was, or it's not, and we have to go through with this, and we have to start discovery and make it a real case.
Yeah.
And one of the lawyers for the federal government, this is all from a Washington Post story, said it is settled, as far as I know. And the other one said, no, we just got new orders that it's not settled.
Yeah,
and
basically.
The judge said, I don't know what's going on here. You guys better clean it up and get back to me by Friday afternoon so we know what's going on here.
Yes.
But it's all because I read Trump's tweets, and so I'm the one directing that you come here and have this emergency meeting here.
It's actually quite remarkable, and it's a short transcript. I might even actually read through it on the air.
But I think I got that right. I think that was the circumstance that happened.
Basically, I think by the time of the call, both lawyers were clear on what the president had done and what the general upshot of it was, but one had better information.
I don't know. As far as I know, it's the same thing as yesterday. And the other one said, no, actually, we do know it's new.
One guy, the assistant attorney general, knew what they were going to do, and it wasn't really up to the other lawyer to say what they were going to do. But what the other lawyer was saying was, as of yesterday when we spoke, when we settled this, I had no other information. I see that the president has now tweeted something, but I cannot offer you any explanation or understanding of what that is going to mean for the case going forward. I can only tell you I'm flat-footed and I'm out of my depth. And then the other one chimed in to say, oh, we're ordering you to go ahead. So it's happening.
So here's from the Washington Post story. And this is just a reminder to everybody that the people who thought that Nixon never should have resigned are still in power.
Oh, yeah.
It says, by then Justice Department officials were scrambling to implement the directive to reverse course and find a way to put the citizenship question back on the census, knowing it could be both practically and legally impossible. People familiar with the matter said. That's the fascinating thing. We were told to do this, and instead of just saying you can't, because reasons, we're just going ahead with it and doing it anyway. That's the part that was a head scratcher. As of 6:30 p.m. Wednesday, that's yesterday, 2020 census forms were still being printed without the question. So it's going to be printed. Now, whether they ditch them all and print new ones is another story.
Right.
But they're printing them without the question.
That is
and then the
what
person, according to the story, said declined to say what other options there are.
Right.
But
I'll tell you.
Hugh Hewitt said, why don't you just give a new executive order, and then everything goes away because the president said so.
Yes. For those
And
of
then
you
Axios
saying,
has a scoop on that.
right, yeah, right. So for those of you saying, oh, but Hugh Hewitt says give an executive order, it's quickly followed up by Axios' scoop, president considering executive order.
Yeah, probably Hugh Hewitt is the top sources that told Jonathan Swan this.
That may very well be. And Tucker Carlson told him not to bomb Iran. So
Right, but again, even from that Axios article, administration lawyers are exploring various legal options, I guess including losing.
yes, that is an option.
Right, that's one of the options.
Or they usually say it's not. Losing is not an option. Well, here it is.
There is considerable skepticism within the administration that an executive order would succeed. And again, I still hold my original position is that John Roberts wanted to give them a gentleman's way out.
Yes.
And they decided not to take it. So if this comes back to Roberts, I think he's going to say no.
It's very likely. Then we'll have to see what that means.
Yeah.
Then
you have your constitutional crisis.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Is this is
because if Roberts says no and then they print it anyway, then you got your crisis right. You got
right.
your crisis right there.
And even then, we're not quite sure we have the crisis
right
there
here.
because then the Roberts court then says, listen, we're not kidding. And here's our order to make it plain. From this point forward,
the marshal of the Supreme Court finally
yeah.
gets to arrest
Donald
Trump.
No printing of this thing with the question on it. And they say that's okay because we've been running the print job.
How many divisions does the Supreme Court have? We got two tanks here sitting right here in Washington.
Yes.
They don't move, but, they're right here.
Now, we can move the trucks that are on and fire at you, presumably, as soon as we put a gun on one of these things. But yeah, eventually when in October the Supreme Court says, listen, I'm serious, no more. From this point forward, we'll make it perfectly clear. It's illegal for you to print this form with the question on it. They say that's good news because we've been printing them since July, so we won't print them from this point forward. We're still in compliance with the Supreme Court. Oh, my goodness, it's going to take us another year to figure out whether this is a constitutional crisis. Oh, at which point the census will be over. Well, things go that way from time to time.
Right.
If you don't have a marshal of the Supreme Court, you're just screwed.
So we will see about that. The other big story that people are talking about is Justin Amash's op-ed. Not that it changes everything.
Right. Okay.
But Justin Amash declares that he is declaring his independence from the Republican Party. He's leaving the party but remaining in Congress for the moment. He's 20 points behind in terms of the next Republican primary in his district in Michigan. And whether he's going to leave altogether and be the Libertarian Party, candidate for president remains to be seen.
Yes, that's also out there.
But it raises interesting questions about what his role is.
Yes. What is your role?
Well, if you're an independent in the House,
yes. Now it's
and
not
you
bipartisan
don't have a caucus,
anymore. Right?
What do you do? When Jim Jeffords left the Republican Party to become an independent, he caucused with the Democrats.
He did.
That was the Senate.
Right.
When who was it? Virgil Goode left the Democratic Party in 2000. Basically, I guess he became a Republican. But Amash doesn't really have a home in either party.
That's right.
So you don't get committee assignments. You don't. The only thing that you could do is make speeches and vote on things. Yes,
those are good things.
They're good things, but without committee assignments, you really don't have any influence over legislation.
Not much.
I mean, you didn't in the minority anyway. No. But you got nothing. You don't even get a chance to make committee speeches.
No. I'm not certain. I mean, I imagine the Trump Republican Party, boots him from the conference and yanks his committee assignments. Although
the man will be without conference or caucus. Imagine that.
Yeah.
We'll have to have a third thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. We'll have to come up with a new.
We'll have to come up with a new name.
Yeah. I don't know what the Democrats will do with that.
I'm part
you can't
of the
let him into the
rumpus.
Democratic caucus. That'd be ridiculous. I wonder, though. I mean, do the Democrats have to? Democrats control the House.
Yes.
I guess what they could do is refuse to consider any more resolutions replacing him on the committees. So you can yank his committee assignments, but we're not putting him anywhere else, and we're not accepting another Republican in his place.
So if you take him out, you got nothing. You're down even one more than you otherwise were.
I mean, it's useless, and so therefore they'll probably just roll for it. But, I mean, I don't know. Let's say the Democratic leadership was in need of some sort of demonstration of flexing muscle and being tough on Republicans. Because, whatever. For
theoretic, right?
Yeah, they could just refuse to accept it. I don't know if they would, because I think they're hoping that in the future they would be treated respectfully if that were to happen to them. But since that won't happen, why bother? But, hey, who can read the future? So we'll see how it goes. We'll see what happens, I guess. And then we'll all be very pleased with that. Blah, blah, blah. It won't make a great deal. If they rolled over for this, it will make zero difference. We were not going to have his vote on anything. Although he did vote for something the other day in committee. I think a contempt resolution. But we have the votes to carry those anyway. It's just nobody's bringing them. So, all right.
Anyway,
man,
those are the two big stories.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to hear a lot. Of course, the other third story, I suppose, is the 4th of July follies in terms of, what's going to be the crowd size and how many people are going to come and is it going to rain? And what role is the military really going to have? Who's not going to show up? Who is going to show up? Are they going to all be QAnon people like at a Trump rally? Is he going to make a speech and make it be a MAGA rally? There's already signs that a lot of that is backfiring, but, we'll see how that plays out. We won't really know more until tomorrow.
Right. I'll be very interested to see what hologram Trump is programmed with saying, and it will be a Hatch Act violation, even though they'll claim it was the president making the speech. It wasn't. And that's one of the only carve-outs that they have for the Hatch Act. So I guess I don't know who's programming it, maybe Kellyanne Conway, because she's already on the hook for a Hatch Act.
Well, probably
can't get worse.
Ivanka and Jared are doing it because, what's the problem?
That could be. By the way, I'm not totally without humanity. Condolences to Ivanka and her siblings on the loss of her father. All right.
So we think. A couple of other things I wanted to follow up on. I mean, those are the big stories, and that's what people are talking about this morning. But we covered in detail on Monday and Wednesday the whole raft and host of polls that came out showing the reordering of what's happening in the Democratic primary a week after last week's debates. But Ron Brownstein has an interesting observation about that latest Iowa poll, the one that showed that I think I sent a graphic of it, that Warren was at 20 and Harris was at 18, Biden at 17, Sanders 12, Buttigieg 10.
I see.
That was a focus on rural poll. I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is Kamala Harris's pollster, one of Kamala Harris's pollsters. Oh. But they've been doing this same poll for a long, long time, even before hooking up with Harris. So they have a track record of polling Iowa. And one of the interesting things that Brownstein found in the crosstabs is that Bernie was winning just 28.4% of voters who backed him in 2016. If you break it out to let's look at who were Sanders voters and who were Clinton voters back in 2016, what are they doing now?
Back when there were two.
So Sanders has 28.4% of those voters. Warren has 26.9%. Pretty graphic, showing that Warren is taking a lot of ex-Sanders people.
People are interested in ideas.
Harris at 12. Mm-hmm. So it's Sanders, Warren, and then a little bit less Harris for those who used to back Sanders. Among Clinton voters, it's Biden 25, Harris 22, and Warren 18. And Sanders is below 2% with the Clinton voters.
Yes, they don't like him.
They don't like him. And Ronald Brownstein has noted, this is what he writes, quote, is no sign of Bernie broadening while others encroach. Making the point that, one of my criticisms of Bernie this time around is that he's done nothing to broaden his base. And these numbers kind of back that up. Now, is there time to change everything? Sure, there's time to change everything. It's way, we got 7 months before stuff matters. But Bernie's Bernie. And just as his supporters say he's the same Bernie he always was, I would point out he's the same Bernie he always was. And I don't see that
true.
changing over the next 7 months.
Yeah, I mean, conditions were great when there were only two, and people were uncomfortable with one.
Right, and some of this was a protest vote.
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't tell me,
But where they're
Bernie
going is also
bad.
interesting.
It's just happening. Yeah,
right, and Harris,
exactly where you'd think they would.
Harris, in other words, is making inroads in both groups.
Yes. Well, she performed exceptionally well, and we'll be seeing that accrue to her in the next couple of days. Warren was always a logical place for Bernie curious folks to land. People who weren't dedicated to Bernie Sanders, but to the ideas he was espousing. And that's kind of what he wanted people to do, right? It's not about me, it's about the ideas. And she espoused some of these similar ideas, and people said, I'm interested in that. I may not get you to the
promised land, said Moses, but I'll be right at the gates. On the other hand,
yes,
making the point that Harris is at 22.5 and Biden 25 with Clinton voters, is that Harris has a foot in both camps, and Harris may be the one unique candidate here who actually can draw from everybody.
It's looking that way because we've said it 2 days in a row.
Right.
It was already
the numbers to back it up.
Right. That's the real point. I'll make the point that you said it, and you make the point that, well, I'm just reading you the numbers.
Yeah, pretty much.
Good. That's solid. That's solid reporting. Yeah.
But it's nice to have your opinions grounded by a little data now and again. That's why I follow the polls so closely.
Yeah.
I think that what they're saying is really unpopular. Well, really, according to this, actually, it's very popular. Oh, well, maybe I should change my opinion. Well, you can't do that. You're paid to
change your
same
opinion.
Thing over
Are
and
you
over.
kidding?
That
Stevens. Would make you a hypocrite.
I'm paid to tell you you're an idiot. I'm
Hugh
Hewitt. I'm paid to tell you everything Trump does is right.
I'd love to have that job. Paid to tell you you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
So there's that, and I just thought that was awfully interesting. Awfully interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Now, here's another thing. Speaking of Elizabeth Warren, which I think was pretty fascinating. This is in Bloomberg.
Let's see.
Elizabeth Warren starts winning begrudging respect on Wall Street. I love it when the lefties on Wall Street decide that, okay, well, maybe things are better than we thought. Financiers drawn to her intelligence, views on social issues. Senators focus on inequality goes mainstream, professor says.
Huh. All right.
I don't generally say bad things about Kamala Harris. I generally don't say bad things about Elizabeth Warren. Of course, to say one good thing about one, sometimes people get mad at you because you didn't say good things about the other.
A few, yes.
I remember the day that I saw one of the things that struck me about Warren is her intelligence, and everybody got on me about that. Oh, yeah? Well, what about Cory Booker, and what about Kamala Harris? I mean, some of these guys are Rhodes Scholars, and why did you say that about Warren? Well, because actually she comes across as being very intelligent. Yeah. It's no knock against anybody else.
I guess other people do, too.
Yeah, but apparently Wall Street thinks that. There's a new whisper on Wall Street. Maybe Elizabeth Warren isn't so bad. The Democratic senator who rose to national prominence by calling for tough regulation after the financial crisis is winning respect from a small but growing circle of senior bankers and hedge fund managers. Now, why is that important? It's not like Wall Street should decide who the next Democratic candidate is. But given the fact that Republicans are going to run against Democratic socialists, it's interesting to say, well, okay, well, here are the people on Wall Street who actually think she's a capitalist.
Right.
Because really she actually respects markets. She just wants them to run properly.
Yeah. Well, that'll last. that'll really
actually
convince
will.
them.
I mean, don't forget, you're not trying to convert the operatives who are pushing the Democratic Socialist meme on the Republican side. You're trying to win the suburbs.
Yes.
Right?
Well, right.
And with them,
and they're
it does work. I mean,
right.
the same messenger can't take the message everywhere. That's why we tolerate never-Trumpers.
Oh.
We being a very broad royal we.
We'll see if never-Trumpers help us carry this message.
Well, they will to this sliver of the population who voted for Trump and has regrets.
All right,
and
we'll see.
That's 8%. It's not big. They, as many others, come up with the dumb, well, if you don't do everything I tell you to, Trump will win.
Yes.
But actually, maybe not. Maybe not if you have messengers like Wall Street saying, you keep saying that the Democratic Party is going too left, but we on Wall Street actually are very comfortable with this.
George
doesn't
Soros would say
that like spoil your message about going too far left if Wall Street is okay with it? Well,
yeah,
it helps
maybe.
Bernie, with his message that, the whole thing is rigged and everybody,
Oh, yeah, right, true.
but that's not really going anywhere. And if he's not the nominee, I don't know where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't.
Is he going to attack Warren and say, I'm not supporting him because Wall Street likes her?
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it depends when he gets around to that. I envision, I guess it depends on the individual Never Trumper. And since there's 12 of them, you can afford to parse it down to the individual level. I assume there'll be some of them that, I don't know. I mean, I guess if an alternative presents itself, like Justin Amash runs for president, I guess then they can say, well, I'm not convinced by George Soros saying she's not a socialist.
That'll be a very tough sell, honestly, because they've made their whole point of being Never Trump. And if they do something that seems to help Trump, that just sort of spoils their brand. So I'm not really.
Well, I'm for spoiling their brand. So that's.
They're paid to be Never Trump. So
yeah.
Stay Never Trump.
Well, they're just currently Amish.
You can't stay within the Republican Party.
I won't.
And not support Trump. And
yes.
Amish and Corker and Flake have proven that. There's just no place for you. Perhaps the only exception might possibly be Romney, only because Utah's kind of weird.
That's true.
They don't like Trump.
You're not supposed to say Romney's weird. Remember that?
Well, Utah's weird.
Yes, right. That's why you're saying.
If you're going to insult people, you might
we
as well insult the entire state. Not just
right.
an individual there.
Do the whole thing.
Utah does not like
but
Trump
I have to say
and
that.
would tolerate a non-Trumper, Never Trumper, a lot more than any other Republican state that I could think of.
Terrific. So that's good. I'm glad that they'll do that. Lemonade is lemon, cool, and wet, and Utah's weird. These are just basic facts.
Just add ice. Yeah.
I am just telling you. I'm just reading you the facts here, people. I'm not opining on this. That will come after this 2-minute break. We'll be back with more and fewer presidents, just as we went into the break.
Another one died?
Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. Except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on it. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Welcome back to all except Donald Trump, who unfortunately passed away 2 days ago, as you know. Just wanted to let everybody know in case you're just tuning in. Greg Dworkin still here with us, both on the radio and in life as well. It's good. This is going well so far. All right,
so far.
Where were we?
Yes. We were just talking about stuff in general and opposition to Trump. This is an interesting tweet from Colin Kahl, who's former deputy assistant to President Obama and national security advisor to VP Biden, now co-director at Stanford CISAC. This is important because everything about this tweet is jargon.
Yeah.
But, maybe that's because Twitter has limited space. But what Colin says is, as Team Trump considers military action versus Iran, they've considered virtually every legal justification from the 2001 Al-Qaeda AUMF, that's the authorization for use of military force,
right,
which DOD, that's the Department of Defense, says is inappropriate, to Trump's claim that it wouldn't involve U.S. ground troops and wouldn't last very long. In other words, they're going through every possible justification they can to come up with some reason for why it's okay to go to war with Iran, which, of course, parallels going through every possible justification put that census question back in.
Right. Yes. Good.
So when you're told that they can't do something, Trump says, "I want it." And instead of resigning in protest out of principle, since everybody left is unprincipled, they scrambled to figure out some way to mollify the toddler in chief.
Yeah.
And that may well wind up with the census being reprinted and going to the Supreme Court. It may well wind up with a war with Iran, which would be incredibly stupid because Trump tore up an agreement which was working well enough and in place has nothing and has alienated everybody in Europe over it, and now it looks like he's headed toward wanting a war.
Mm-hmm. Those all sound like stupid things.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why you don't want to vote for people who are not qualified to be president.
Yeah,
and that was one of the objections we had about Trump from the very beginning. So whatever you think of his horrible personality and the fact that he's a crook, he also was like totally unqualified. Now you can decide in your own mind which of those two things is more important: the horrible person or the horrible, abilities or lack of same. But either way, they get you to the same place, which is where we are now. And so, the Iran thing is just, it's not, it's real. I mean, they're really trying to figure out how to do this. Now, somebody pointed out John Bolton has lasted this long because administratively, he's very good at behind the scenes administrative type stuff. And what I mean by that is that if he gets involved with something he thinks is going to fail, like the North Korea initiatives, he isolates himself. I wasn't even there. I was in Mongolia.
Oh, I see, yeah.
That isn't my problem. It's your problem. But he's still there, and he's very much involved, and he wants to go to war with Iran. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, that's, by the way, interesting justification. A very Trumpian justification to say, well, we can go to war because it wouldn't last very long.
Right.
Which, that's not really any kind of justification.
Although, no, legally, it won't last very long, and so I'm in very solid legal ground.
Right. I guess that's it.
I mean, that's what he's saying.
Or
right?
But by the time the other interpretation is, by the time the legal system gets around to proving that it isn't justified, it'll be over. So why not do it and then apologize later, like with Indian policy?
I'm not saying that Trump is impulsive and stupid, but I wrote on Twitter yesterday, I'm really hoping somebody in the Defense Department tells Trump that tactical nuclear weapons are not fireworks. Because I was really worried he'd just set one off at the mall because he really, really wants to make a big show.
I guess so. Well, and it's unusual that he would have gathered all of his supporters into a small area.
Look at that.
But well,
without glasses, by the way. I just stare at the sun.
That's true. You know what? That's entirely. He's done that, of course, with the eclipse. That would help explain the way, the patterns that he has painted on his face from time to time.
I suppose.
Yeah.
The other story, of course, that is not going away are the horrible conditions in the detention centers, also known as concentration camps.
Yes.
And they are concentration camps, and that that argument is settled. So I have to go back to Adam Sower. This dates back to October of 2018, and it was just such a brilliant insight back then, which we're seeing played out now.
Everyone says
this is a story in the Atlantic, and the title is "The Cruelty is the Point." Yeah. Everybody's using that term now.
Right. That's
because
the
it's
new
obvious
axis of
to
evil.
Everybody that trying to have kids in these horrible conditions is exactly what Stephen Miller wanted, under the mistaken impression that that would stop people from coming here from Central America. It was a deterrent, and it's intended. And they don't want to make it better because this is what they're trying to do. And the fact that it's not working doesn't seem to have, registered with them.
No.
Because they're taking the position of, look, we're doing this to make sure that immigration attempts, that asylum requests and people coming here in general go down. That's why we're doing this. Mm-hmm. But, even if it doesn't work, at least it's cruel.
Yeah, right. This is the policy being made by the kid that pulls the wings off flies. This will discourage other flies from coming here.
Yeah.
So, okay. I guess that's what you get. Brilliant phrasing, and I think a timeless one that will live.
I saw Adam Schiff use it yesterday.
Yeah, everybody.
Everybody's
There's no
using it.
more succinct way of putting it.
And credit to Adam Silver for pointing that out months ago. President Trump and his supporters find community by rejoicing in the suffering of those they hate and fear, is his subheader, and it's true.
Yes.
But then he wrote one on July 3rd of this year, in other words, yesterday.
Yes,
A crime by any name. The Trump administration's commitment to deterring immigration through cruelty has made horrifying conditions in detention facilities inevitable.
Yes.
Right? And he goes through history about other situations like Andersonville, Civil War.
Yeah, well,
Nearly
that
every
prevented
nation
us
has
from
used
having a
camps at
civil
some
war.
point, though the degree to which their populations have embraced them and the devastation wreaked by each camp system has varied widely. Historian Andrew Pitzer says the worst effects tend to be dampened in freer societies where legal systems and legislatures have an opportunity to act. Yet a relatively healthy democracy is just as capable of instituting camps as the most corrupt communist society or military dictatorship, sometimes with horrific results. So it was leading story on NBC Nightly News yesterday. It's not going away. There are now visuals. There's stories by pediatricians, another Atlantic story. What a pediatrician saw inside a Border Patrol warehouse.
Oh,
the
yes.
pediatricians are taking care of the kids as they come out, and they're just drawing these horrific pictures, child pictures, of themselves being kept in cages.
Yeah.
So the
Because it's
devastation to them from a psychological point of view is real and will persist. In any case, Adam Silver wrote about this,
Yes.
and then there was this really interesting thread by Aaron Reichlin Melnick. And who is Aaron Reichlin Melnick? Let's see. This is
Sounds like a Yiddish writer.
policy analyst at the Immigration Council, formerly immigration lawyer at Legal Aid New York City.
That's different.
Right, so he's got some expertise on this, and that's one of the reasons why I thought it was interesting.
Okay.
And he says,
This one.
this piece from Adam Silver was great, and everybody should read it, the one I was
it is.
talking about,
Yeah.
the detention camps. And that said, I wanted to dissect one paragraph in it because it encapsulates the extreme difficulty of talking about and reporting on immigration detention.
All right.
Take a journey into nuance with me. I love nuance, so
All right.
it's one of the reasons I liked it.
Good time for journeys.
Okay? This is the paragraph in Adam Silver's piece that I'm going to overthink. It powerfully collects primary source reports about detention, but also, number one, conflates types of immigration detention. Number two, gets a fact wrong. And three, mistakenly implies people with legal status aren't detained. Here's the paragraph. At a processing center in El Paso, Texas, 900 migrants were being held at a facility designed for 125. In some cases, cells designed for 35 people were holding 155, the New York Times reported. One observer described the facility to Texas Monthly as a human dog pound. I mean, these are the images and descriptions that people are hearing and getting upset about. And when you have visuals, it just makes it worse. The government's own investigators have found detainees in facilities run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement being fed expired food at detention facilities, nooses in detainee cells, inadequate medical care, and unsafe and unhealthy conditions. An early July Inspector General report found dangerous overcrowding in some Border Patrol facilities and included pictures of people crowded together like human cargo. More than 50,000 people are being held in facilities run by ICE, something close to 20,000 in facilities run by CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and more than 3,000 unaccompanied migrant children in the custody of DHS.
Yes.
Some of the people detained by the U.S. government have entered the U.S. illegally or overstayed their visas. Some are simply seeking to exercise their legal right to asylum. That's the paragraph.
All right. That's from Adam's.
That's from Adam's piece.
Got it.
And I find myself confused by a lot of this, too, and that's why I'm grateful for this particular tweet storm here. Before I go any further, I need to provide some basic background information on the three agencies that appear in the paragraph. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR. So let's start with CBP.
All right.
Who does CBP detain, why, and for how long? These are the nuanced clarifications that I found so helpful. CBP detains people who cross the border, asylum seekers who go to ports of entry, anybody arrested by Border Patrol inside the U.S. They detain people for quick in-theory processing, and then they transfer them to ICE or ORR. So they round them up. They're supposed to keep them for a very brief period of time, turn them over to other people.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Next, ICE. Who does ICE detain and why and for how long? ICE detains any non-citizen the government is seeking to deport, potentially for as long as the process takes, and that can take years. So CBP is supposed to keep them for a few days. ICE can keep them for whatever.
Jail versus prison.
Right? ICE detains everybody from undocumented immigrants to asylum seekers and those with green cards.
Yes.
So the range of people that ICE can detain is much bigger. And then finally, ORR, which is DHS. ORR isn't a detention agency. It contracts with licensed shelters to hold unaccompanied children while searching for a sponsor, usually family, to take the child. But in recent months, ORR has sent kids to unlicensed influx shelters. So go back to the paragraph. Okay? Yellow is CBP, and blue is ICE, purple is ORR, and green is either one. So he's separating that paragraph into the 4 different agencies or the 3 different agencies with overlap that are applicable here. So the facility the Texas Monthly described as a human dog pound is CBP.
Okay.
The government investigators who have found detainees in facilities run by ICE being fed expired food, that's ICE. It's not CBP, different agency.
Okay.
More than 50,000 people are being held in facilities run by ICE, that's ICE. But an early July Inspector General report found dangerous overcrowding in Border Patrol facilities, so that's CBP. And then there's 3,000 unaccompanied migrant children in the custody of DHS. And what he's trying to say is it's an excellent article, but when you run all of the different horrific things together, you lose sight of who's responsible for each one of the different problems. Now, it's all federal government.
Yes.
But it's different agencies. And if you're oversight committee and you're trying to figure out what's going on here, you really have to separate out which agency is doing what and what they should be doing so that you can apply proper oversight. And for political purposes and getting the public upset, it doesn't matter.
True.
But for fixing it, it does.
Yes.
And we want to fix it.
Oh, okay. Well, Adam,
we don't just want it up there to be,
job, of course,
get upset. You need to do that to put pressure on them.
Yeah.
Okay. And for example, SORA unintentionally gives the impression that ICE is only detaining people without legal status, some of whom are asylum seekers. But ICE locks up thousands of legal immigrants it's trying to deport, including people with green cards who have been here for decades. And that's why ICE does these raids and breaks up communities. And it isn't just, oh, well, we went up to find the 3 people who just got here last week. That's not what they're doing. That's a completely different level of community disruption because they're empowered to take people who've been living there for decades. That's not what CBP does.
True.
Right? So, it's... Now, none of what I said in this thread takes away from the article itself, which presents a fantastic historical comparison to show how CBP's decision to focus on detention over any possibility of release has led to appalling conditions. But nuance is necessary for solutions. Until we think why each agency is doing what it's doing, until we address the problems distinct and separate to each agency, we risk losing sight of actual concrete solutions that require nuanced analysis. Anyway, good piece, go read it. And so I just wanted to bring to people's attentions, for the purposes of outrage, you don't need to separate them. For the purposes of policy and for the purposes of fixing the problem, you do.
Yes.
And putting everything together in terms of, it's like, well, they're putting kids in cages. Which kids? The kids who have come for asylum? Or the kids that they picked up who have been living in the community for 3.5 years? I mean, they're different groups.
Yeah. If they're both in cages.
And they're both in cages, and that's bad. But if you can't remember which agency does what, just at least keep in your mind that they're different agencies and there
Always
may
worth
be a
doing.
different group of people that you're referring to. And so just, be
Yes.
aware that's true.
Well, this is a good thing to keep handy. If, for instance, this will alleviate more. I don't know, more confusion and angst. Will be at the point where the, let's say, one of the appropriate appropriations subcommittees do things like, well, we'll report out a bill that cuts the DHS budget by X amount because of this detention activity with which we differ. And then people say, why didn't you deal with the CBP abuse? Well, it's a different appropriations subcommittee. They will be the one cutting that budget.
Or differently, you might say, look, we're very uncomfortable with what ICE is doing. Yeah, but all you people who keep saying abolish ICE just want open borders. Well, actually, ICE doesn't do that. It's CBP.
Yes, that's true. That's a great point for that one. We can absolutely abolish ICE without abolishing border protection. That's an entirely different agency. That's true. Now, they also are
with a different charge, who are picking
Right.
up different people. Do
Yes.
you not understand that? Don't you know the difference?
That's true. That's good.
Between
worth
a
pointing out.
magazine and a clip?
Right. Or I guess a variant of that would be, of the abolish ICE people do what they do, and it's good stuff, and they get politicians, members of Congress to agree. I'm with you. I sign on to abolish ICE, and then they abolish ICE, and then people are saying, but look, there's still cruelty going on. And
I thought we fixed this problem.
Right.
Well, you didn't address, this
And
other thing
that-
over here.
that
Anyway,
alleviates
it's
the,
nuanced, but we
yeah.
do nuance on the show, and I just thought it was good
No,
to go over that
true.
in detail.
That's a good point. I think they'll sort it out at the committee level. I guess I hope it doesn't lead to confusion that then leads to additional anger. Like, I thought we took care of this problem, and instead of allowing for time to say, well, but that's CBP, and we have to sort of deal with that one separately. What we did, what you wanted on ICE. Hopefully, the reaction to that isn't, well, you sold us out. You abolished ICE in name only, or something like that, and you're a bunch of sellouts, and we need to have you gone. Well, but hold on a second. We haven't yet gotten to CBP, and that's next. But I think at that point, if I handed them an article that with color highlighting, they would probably just get angry at me. But this is true, and we need to know it. So
Anyway, that's
Now we
my
do.
July 4th segment for today. The rest is on you.
that's right. Well, yes, okay. So we'll highlight in yellow what you have done, and do not conflate it with what I do.
At
later
least
on.
verbally.
Yes, right. So, all right, yeah, that is a good piece. We should file that. We're going to need that at some point to sort these things out as we
Yeah, it's
try to
one of
hammer
those
out
things you actually
solutions.
come back to.
like Adam's article.
Yep.
There you go.
All right. So take care. Have a great July 4th.
All right. I'll
Let's
do my
hope
best.
Fearless Girl shows up at the mall, stands in front of the tanks. And
Yeah.
I'll be back, and we'll talk Monday.
Okay. Very good. Thanks, Greg. Have a great weekend. A long weekend for a lot of people.
Yep.
All right. Hope you have a good one too. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be a great thing to do, is to bring the Fearless Girl down here, because the tanks are stationary. Also, people are disputing whether or not they are tanks, and there are 4 sizable armored vehicles now. I think they're all there, but they're destined to be parked around the Lincoln Memorial. Remember the other day we were fretting about that. People were saying, I'm not certain if the vehicles being as heavy as they are will undermine the foundation of the Lincoln Memorial, but we weren't sure yet that they were even going to be parked there. But that's the only place that makes sense. That's where Trump has put his VIP section, and he wants the tanks there to impress the VIPs. He doesn't care about the rest of the people, so they're going to have to put them nearby. And I think there were some photos available of the smaller of the 2 types of vehicles, and I think there's only 4, which is amazing. 4 heavy armored vehicles in total. 2 are, I think, originally I had heard reported that 2 of them were in fact Abrams tanks, and 2 of them were Bradley fighting vehicles. Both are armored. both have guns, one larger than the other. But it looked like there were photos available of the Bradley vehicles, at least, at the Lincoln Memorial, in the Lincoln Memorial Plaza area, being parked for people to, I don't know, take selfies with or whatever they do. But they're not driving anywhere. It's not entirely clear whether they're going to be on the ground or still stuck on those trailers that they were hauled through D.C. on. There was, I believe, a diary up yesterday, and I guess it's still up there on the recommended list, that says that appears to imply that all of the vehicles sent were in fact Bradley fighting vehicles, and there were no tanks. But I am not certain that that's the case, and I guess we'll have to wait for actual photos of the event to start filtering out before we're able to identify those things. But I don't know. I don't know if it's worth obsessing over. Although, again, I guess here's something else I'll clear up. There's been lots of discussion of how the streets of D.C. were likely not up to the task of carrying these 60-ton tanks. And the Abrams tank, I guess, is what they're talking about there, the 60-ton thing. But as we talked about yesterday on the air with Joan and Armando both on hand, there is, in fact, a history of bringing such armored vehicles through Washington. And Joan correctly recalled seeing Abrams tanks parading after the 1991 Gulf War through the streets of D.C., and we did find pictures of that. And there's a couple of them in there, and there's a similar article, actually, that was run probably the last round of discussion of whether or not Trump was actually going to get his military parade. There were a couple rounds of such discussion, and the second round of them, I think, was here, February 2018. So it's a Mother Jones article that just, actually quite interesting historical context, says, actually, the U.S. has a rich tradition of military parades, but normally they're after military victories and stuff. And, of course, we have not had that military victory here. We just have this Bone Spurs guy who is getting beautiful letters from dictators. That's not a military victory by itself, but okay, that's the usual justification for these things. And by the way, it's worth pointing out, I guess, if you're keeping score at home, 2 Bradley fighting vehicles, maybe 2 Abrams tanks, that's 4 armored vehicles that they're having such trouble with. That still leaves it, I think, if you're counting, more draft deferments for Donald Trump than armored vehicles for his military parade. So that's actually quite a remarkable accomplishment and probably hasn't been done before. All right. Well, here's the photographic evidence of the American tradition, a rich American tradition of military parades in Washington, D.C., which is interesting because, I think a lot of people have forgotten about those. As has now widely been reported, really. That's how Mark Murman, Murrmann, reported this for Mother Jones way back when in February of last year. As has now been widely reported in a meeting last month, so that would be January 2018, President Trump told high-ranking military officials that he wanted a military parade. No reason, just wanted it. But over history, the United States has generally left military parades as a chest-thumping show of force to less self-assured despots and Russia. The last time the United States held a national Tanks in the Streets military parade was over 25 years ago. It doesn't feel that long, but it really has been that long. In 1991, to celebrate the end of the Gulf War. And before that, large military parades hadn't been seen since the early 60s, when Cold War tensions led Kennedy and Eisenhower to flex some ballistic muscle during their inauguration parades. I think it was observed at some point that, maybe tanks had been paraded through the streets, but what Trump really wanted was probably the missile carriers like they have in China and North Korea and occasionally in the old Soviet Union too, and he didn't get any of those. And he didn't, but I think he asked for them. But we've had those too, in case you were wondering. That has in fact happened, and there are pictures of it in this article. So, as we now face Trump's request, here's a quick look at what the national military parades have been like over the years in the U.S. when troops came home from World War I and World War II, and after Operation Desert Storm, and when the parades were not just an exercise in ego stroking, although I think you could probably make a good case that that was what was happening too. A couple of pictures in here. The first of a group of helicopters arriving near a Harrier jump jet on Capitol Hill on June 7th, 1991, following the end of the Gulf War. The equipment was to be on display during the National Victory Celebration in Washington, D.C. the following day. The next shot is of a flag-waving crowd of approximately 200,000 cheering veterans of Operation Desert Storm as the nation's capital staged its biggest victory celebration since the end of World War II. Led by General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, remember him? About 8,800 troops marched across Arlington Memorial Bridge on June 8, 1991. 31 war machines, such as M1 tanks, the big ones, yes, Humvees, rocket launchers, and the famed Patriot missile were also included in the parade. So there you go. Now, Patriot missile is not an intercontinental ballistic missile, to be sure, but the effect is much the same. But I guess the real point of this one is here is a photo of an Abrams tank coming across the Arlington Memorial Bridge. I think that's what's in this photo. It appears so from the background. And now I guess Joan pointed out, and a very real thing about this, as we said, so it's more than 25 years since that parade, right? 1991. It's even more than that, isn't it? I don't know. Anyway, more than 25 years. I think that encapsulates it. That's 25 additional years of, we forgot our music here. 25 additional years of wear and tear on the bridge. And so it is entirely possible that 25 years ago it was able to support the weight of an Abrams tank, and that today it simply is not. All right. Well, we'll exit a little earlier in our music today, but take a 1-minute break nonetheless and be back after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got some additional music going on in the background because we started it late, but I assure you, we are in fact back now. Look at this. Here's a good one. I'm going to have to retweet this one. Stop making good tweets, everybody. I need to pause the world for this one to be retweeted. Who's this? Let's pull this one up here. Ploeg. How do we pronounce that out loud? I don't know. Is your last name Logue and you're Peter Logue? I have no idea. I'm sorry, but thanks for sharing this one with us. New York Times says, this was the day that Donald Trump's corpse truly became president. They didn't actually say that, but we might as well have. All right, let's see. Back to the Mother Jones article, just for interesting historical context. And like I said, it is entirely possible that with our decaying infrastructure, 25 years ago, the Arlington Memorial Bridge was up to the task of holding an Abrams tank, and today it's borderline. So that could be it. All right. The next picture is of the troops. And it gives us a somewhat clearer picture of what's going on here, too, because you can see the troops marching very smartly across what is now obviously the Arlington Memorial Bridge, with the Lincoln Memorial clearly in the background and the distinctive architecture of the bridge now clearly visible, and the tanks behind them. So, I mean, like, that definitely happened. Troops marched over the Memorial Bridge, the caption says, in Washington, D.C., as they headed toward the Pentagon in 1991. Oh, so they're on their way out, interestingly, too. So they're marching back to the Pentagon. I mean, that's not what's on the other side of the Arlington Memorial Bridge, and I doubt they marched them all the way to the Pentagon, though our troops would have been capable of doing that, no doubt, that their physical conditioning was such, but it's a fairly significant distance to walk to toward the Pentagon. Though that is true, they are heading toward the Pentagon. I can see that the troops are turning along with the curvature of the street. That is the direction of the Pentagon. So technically correct. We move on. The next picture is old, and you can tell because black and white, and also a very different looking Washington, D.C. with trolley tracks down the middle of the street here, Pennsylvania Avenue being the street. This is a picture from 1961 of an Army, and several of them, Army Pershing missile mounted on a tank-like carrier, that is to say with tracks. A tank-like carrier rode down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. as part of the inaugural parade for President John F. Kennedy. Following behind were additional missiles from the front, where they are identified as the Lacrosse missile. I didn't even know we had such a missile. And Lacrosse bros are all proud of that one, I am sure. The Nike Hercules and the Nike Zeus missiles, to not actually sponsored by Nike, the footwear company. Controversial Nike footwear company now in the news for reasons best really not covered here on the show, although it is a political controversy. But we have too much to get to in order to get to that. Now, what's interesting on this photo, in addition to the fact that there are trolley tracks down Pennsylvania Avenue, which we later tore up, got rid of, and then later replaced with non-tracked trams later. Yeah, we've been. That's a whole other evolution of transportation show that we could do a different day. But the trolley tracks are gone. But what's visible in this picture is the damage that the tracks on the tanks and missile carriers are actually doing to the streets. It's actually visible. So mistake there from President Kennedy. And I guess maybe that's what gave us the idea that they'll ruin the streets, the fact that they actually did. Although no such damage visible in the photos from the M1 tanks after the Gulf War. So I guess that's possible too, that there might be some urban legend factor going on here. But they damaged the streets with lighter tanks in 1961. I guess maybe the materials used for the streets may have changed. I don't know. The next picture is one that displays no road damage anyway, but that's because the tanks haven't rolled past yet. It's a picture of President Dwight Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon. You've heard about that guy. He's really cool and everything. Nixon and Eisenhower, it says here, got a close-up look at 90-millimeter guns on Army tanks rolling along Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House reviewing stand during their inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. in 1957. No word on what happened to the streets after the tanks went by in this one. But I did see, I think, David Frum tweeting yesterday about President Eisenhower's supposed disdain for military hardware being put on parade in Washington, D.C. on his behalf, and how awful he thought it was, and that was supposed to prove that there are some good Republicans, too, who aren't so jingoistic, et cetera, et cetera. But then there was published this photo of Eisenhower totally not enjoying his own inaugural parade with the tanks. I don't know. Maybe he came to that conclusion later. It was supposedly a statement from 1959. In 1959, he said, it damaged the streets, and I was really upset about that. He changed his mind. The next picture, even older here, from 1946, soldiers stood at attention in their vehicles. You can't really tell that they're at attention in their vehicles, quite honestly, but although they are, it looks like they have their arms folded, which is an interesting method of standing at attention. Anyway, soldiers stood at attention in their vehicles, which carried the cannon-like heavy artillery weapons, 8-inch howitzers, during the victory parade of the 82nd Airborne Division down Fifth Avenue in New York in 1946. Very impressive-looking guns. They're not tanks. They're, what is that? Is that like self-propelled artillery? Is that the proper designation for it? Doesn't matter. But that was New York. So totally different. Here, members in the next picture, members of the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division paraded through the Washington Square Arch in New York City. I guess it's the same parade during the World War II Victory Parade on January 12th, 1946. Probably the same day. It looks pretty cold out there. And again, marching smartly in formation. Next up, troops marched in a Memorial Day parade in Washington, D.C. in May of 1942, right in the middle of the war. So that would have carried a very different message. And not a place where we were celebrating victory either, May of 1942. Still, we were in the middle of World War II, and I guess it wouldn't have been surprising to have seen a military parade at that point. Even earlier than that, an Army tank passed in front of the U.S. Capitol building during an Army Day parade in April of 1939. Very different looking kind of tank. Probably considerably lighter than the ones we're dealing with today, but who knows what the streets were paved with back then. And a few more. One more. U.S. Marines marching down Fifth Avenue in New York. They could have shot people there and not lost any votes. In September of 1919, which you can tell from all these straw boater hats that are out there in the crowd. Nearly a year after the end of World War I, General John J. Pershing himself, the guy the missiles are named after, led the victory parade through New York. A week later, Pershing led a similar parade through Washington, D.C. And I'm sure people probably thought that was a relatively dangerous thing, and we never had a President Pershing. So I guess that tells you something about the way it used to be back in the olden days. All right. Let's see. Moving on from there, let's check back in Pocket and see what else there is to look in on. Maybe now is the time to go over to the fuller details of the citizenship question story. And let me see. I think we have to park some of these things back in Pocket for later on and see what's the most appropriate way of approaching this question here, or the question of the question. Well, I think Greg gave you a pretty good summary of what was in the Washington Post story. Reversing course, Trump administration will look for a way to add citizenship question to the 2020 census. That was yesterday at 8:40. Shall we run through that one? Maybe that would help us in understanding the transcript if we go that direction. Who are our reporters here? Tara Barampour, I'm guessing at the pronunciation there, Matt Zapotowski, and Josh Dawsey. At the late hour of 8:40 last night, the Justice Department said Wednesday that the government is looking for a way to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census just one day after it said it would drop that effort and was printing the form without it. And again, we don't know what that means. Don't know how many they were printing. We were complying with the order. We printed one, and then we printed the rest of them with the question. Or, as some people have posited, what about the forms without the question, but live census takers do ask the question? We don't know which mix of things it will be. The course reversal came just hours after President Trump said he was, quote, absolutely moving forward, unquote, with adding the question, in a tweet that seemed to catch government lawyers off guard as they were summoned by two federal judges. Oh, okay, to explain the administration's change of heart. I only know about one of the judges. The reversal came during a phone call with a federal judge in Maryland who had ruled against including the question, and shortly afterward in a filing to a New York federal judge who had also ruled against the question. Joseph Hunt, Assistant Attorney General for the department's Civil Division, said the administration was looking for a legal path forward after the Supreme Court last week froze the administration's plan to include it on the survey sent to every U.S. household, and said the administration needed to provide a better justification if it wants to add it. That was, I guess, the weak point of what was going on. I don't know if the court really had very many other options, but this was something we warned you about last week when the decision was issued, that it wasn't a ruling on the merits that such a question was simply impermissible, but rather a ruling that said that the inclusion of the question was at this point too arbitrary and capricious a question. It was a question of administrative procedure. Had the government offered a non how will we put it? Had they offered a sufficient explanation for including the question that wasn't simply that they were looking to discriminate against Democratic-leaning voters and leave them out of the census, and in light especially of the information that had come out with these, I guess, newly released notes from the Republican redistricting guru, who basically says outright that this is a terrific weapon for suppressing Democratic votes. So what was the reasoning? Originally, the Census Department had said that they had been directed by the Justice Department to include the question because it was going to help them with the administration of the Voting Rights Act, and that ended up falling apart as an excuse. And then basically the court kind of, I think, felt the pressure to say, well, now that we have this, essentially this admission that this was done for discriminatory purposes, we ask you, what is your reason? Since the DOJ one fell apart, what reason do you have for including this? And they couldn't come up with one. But the Supreme Court, I guess, technically left it open to them and said, well, based on what you've filed with us, this is garbage and we can't allow it. But if there's another reason that you might want to include such a question that isn't facially discriminatory, I guess we'd be open to hearing it. So now that's what they're working on. I think everybody was supposed to think that this was the end of the line and that there wouldn't be such an effort, because at some point during the proceedings, the government actually, I think, attempted to pressure the courts into, I think they thought they were attempting to pressure the courts into allowing the question by saying, well, we've got to have a decision and we got to have it soon because all the experts, whoever they are, or if there are any, say that we have to make our final decision on what's going to be in the questionnaire and what's not by July 1st so that we can get enough of these things printed in time to carry out our constitutional duty to conduct the census, which is another constitutional duty, of course, that Donald Trump tweeted that he really didn't take seriously, and maybe I'll delay the census. We've already forgotten about that one. Anyway, their position was that July 1st was the deadline, and a drop-dead deadline at that, and we absolutely had to have the decision. So courts obviously are going to find in our favor. But instead the court said, you know what? The answer is your justification isn't good enough. And if the July 1st deadline comes and goes, then I guess you're just going to have to print it without the question, because there's no time for you to come up with a justification that will satisfy us before the deadline. Except yesterday, part of the discussion between the lawyers and the judges ended up being, that deadline isn't real, which creates a different problem, the one of having told the federal courts, and including the Supreme Court of the United States, that there was such a deadline and it really meant something. That's going to land some people in trouble eventually too, possibly. All right. So, Joe Hunt, the Assistant Attorney General, told Judge George G. Hazel of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland that justice lawyers had been, quote, instructed to examine whether there is a path forward consistent with the Supreme Court's decision. So again here, I don't know whether they actually mean it, but they're trying to give every appearance of not defying the Supreme Court. This is why I said, pardon me, this is why I said earlier that I think they're looking to prolong this whole process and trying to dissuade people from coming to the conclusion that we're actually at that constitutional crisis, which everyone has been anticipating, but the administration's lawyers keep insisting we're not at. We're not defying a Supreme Court. We're trying to be consistent with the Supreme Court. The question is whether that's really possible or not. But as long as they have people willing to print that they're trying to be consistent and not pointing out that there's no real way of doing that, then I guess we're still not there, and we can dither a little bit more about whether or not to impeach the president. Hunt did not say who issued the instruction, by the way, and that is because the president is dead, and he can't get away with saying that the president issued the instruction. He's not alive to do so. So he didn't want to get in trouble with the court, you see. All right. In a separate filing to Judge Jesse Furman of the Southern District of New York late Wednesday afternoon, Hunt wrote, he's involved in both cases, of course, that the Justice and Commerce Departments had been asked to, quote, reevaluate all available options, unquote, and that Commerce may adopt, quote, a new rationale, unquote, for including the question, which is the rough equivalent of the court saying, you're lying, I know it, and it's provable, this excuse is no longer operative, and them saying, well, give me 5 minutes and I'll come up with a better lie. The government has said in multiple legal battles that it needed the question on the form to help enforce the Voting Rights Act. It is not clear what a new rationale would be. The discussions came amid a day of legal turmoil triggered by a Wednesday morning tweet from Trump that his administration was, quote, absolutely moving forward with its plan. By the way, I guess you see the formations of the new rationale happening among idiot right-wing Twitter, Rudy Giuliani, Hugh Hewitt, and the like, which, also hasn't been tested, but is also pretty stupid on its face. They just give the very Trump-like answer of, well, don't we want to know exactly how many citizens there are, and how many non-citizens there are living in the country? And we do, but we have, other methods of finding that out that are already operative, and we have that data, and we don't use the census to gather it, and there would be no need to use the census to gather it. And also, the census is about enumerating the total population of residents of whatever status, because that is how we apportion representation in the country. So it would be inappropriate at this point, I think, to ask on the census questions that are extraneous to the purpose of the census, especially if we already get that information elsewhere and get it accurately. If the government wants to contend that it is getting inaccurate information from elsewhere, the solution would be, of course, as we learned earlier about being specific about who's responsible for what, fix the process you're currently using for enumerating citizens versus non-citizens, rather than trying to adapt some other procedure to that purpose. Anyway, the news reports about the Department of Commerce dropping its quest to put the citizenship question on the census is incorrect, or, to state it differently, fake. Trump allegedly someone wrote on his behalf since his death, we are absolutely moving forward, and we must, because of the importance of the question, of the answer to this question, which, again, is not a reason to include it on the census. I mean, the question of why are we all here? What is our purpose in life is an important question. We don't put it on the census because the census isn't really equipped to deal with answering it. And asking it will foul the results of the one purpose the census actually has. Of course, just as the cruelty is the point, fouling the census is the point in this case. They want to come up with a miscount. And by the way, I have every reason to believe that although factually, as Armando pointed out, it may be the case that some congressional seats are lost in New York, not that it would make a terrible amount of difference in terms of the composition, the partisan composition of the House of Representatives as a whole. But remember that Donald Trump is also rhetorically committed to the proposition that people are fleeing New York by the millions to get away from high taxation. I assume that it is Donald Trump's intention to see to it that the census minimizes the population of New York in order to bolster his fake point about the millions who are fleeing. Hazel, this is one of the judges, is that right? I need to scroll back. Is that that's the Maryland judge? Yes, who's, I think, quoted in the transcript that's being circulated. Hazel said he had seen the tweet, a transcript of the phone call shows, and ordered lawyers in the Maryland case to get on an afternoon call with him to try to clarify the government's plans in a case that appeared to be resolved as of Tuesday night. But even on that call, there was discord among Justice Department lawyers. The transcript of the call shows that Joshua Gardner, who had led the government defense team in the cases before Hazel, said as far as he knew, the whole issue had been resolved Tuesday. The question was removed, and the form was being printed without it. The president's tweet was the first he had heard otherwise. The tweet this morning was the first I had heard of the president's position on the issue, just like the plaintiffs and Your Honor, Gardner said to the judge, the transcript shows. I do not have a deeper understanding of what that means at this juncture other than what the president has tweeted, but obviously, as you can imagine, I am doing my absolute best to figure out what's going on. So I think that a closer reading of that statement is I thought it was settled too, but it clearly isn't now. It's not that he's saying, no, I still believe that it's settled. It's that I no longer know what to represent to you on behalf of the government. I have no idea. It's clearly not settled, but it's clear that I don't know what it is other than not settled. Gardner turned the call over to Hunt, who said the plan was to try to move ahead. Plaintiffs in the case expressed outrage Wednesday night over the backtracking. Under this administration, there's no accounting for doubling down on stupid. Okay. Thomas A. Saenz, I'm guessing, S-A-E-N-Z, President and General Counsel of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, said in a statement, today's reversal from yesterday's certainty repeats the pattern of this entire affair, which began with Secretary Wilbur Ross, who inexplicably remains in the cabinet, lying to Congress and the public about the reason for the late attempted addition of a citizenship question to Census 2020. MALDEF, that's the acronym for the Mexican-American Legal Defense, right, is fully prepared to demonstrate in court that racism is the true motivation for adding the question, and by doing so, to prevent the question from appearing on the census. They are right, of course. Dale Ho, director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project and lead attorney for the plaintiffs in the New York trial, vowed that any attempt at an end run around the Supreme Court's decision will be unsuccessful and will be met swiftly in court. Hazel told the government that it has until 2 p.m. Friday to put into writing that the question was dropped or tell him how it planned to defend against a legal challenge in his court contending the question arose from an intent to discriminate against minorities. If the government fails to report by then, Hazel said, he will start moving forward with discovery in the case before him. The claim of conspiracy and intent to discriminate had been sent back by an appeals court to Hazel after new evidence suggested that the government had worked with a Republican redistricting strategist who saw the question as a way to provide a structural electoral advantage to white Republicans. Hazel had initially ruled that the plaintiffs had not proved that charge, and you can imagine how that would have gone. Like, absent evidence like they left behind, memos that said, P.S., I love this because it will give us a structural advantage for white Republicans and discriminate against everybody else. It's the sort of thing that you charge and judges say, yeah, but can you prove it? And then the system ends up dismissing because, well, you got to have solid proof in our system. Otherwise, it's just conjecture. Even if everybody feels in their bones that you're right and feels bad about it, we just can't prove it, so we can't hand you the victory here in court. The amazing situation was that they actually got this evidence. The absolute proverbial smoking gun memo actually turned up, and the court had to turn around. They were on the cusp of saying, I believe you, the logic makes sense, but the proof isn't there. And then the proof magically showed up, as though it was a sign from God. But here we are again anyway, debating whether or not it actually makes a difference. Oh, well, we'll come up with a different excuse. And if not, a different God. So we'll do anything to win. Anyway, so where were we? Hazel had initially ruled that the plaintiffs had not proved that charge, but after new evidence came to light proving it, he said he would reconsider it. And I think we know where it's going. In its divided decision last Thursday, believe it or not, the Supreme Court said the Commerce Secretary had not provided an adequate explanation for adding the citizenship question. But the decision provided an opening for the agency to come up with a better justification. Ignore the racism memo. It's really something else. Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., in case you mistake him for a different Chief Justice Roberts, said that Ross deserved great deference in deciding how to run the census, but that his explanation was contrived. The ruling affirmed the lower court decision in which Furman, the New York judge, said the question could only be added by resolving its legal defects. All right, so at least that did seem to leave something of a door open. It was unclear after the Supreme Court ruling whether there would be time for the administration to come up with an acceptable justification to meet judicial muster. It really wasn't. I mean, it was a closed issue. It wasn't unclear because the government had sworn on that stack of Bibles that July 1st was the day, and then when they lost, they found some extra time. So they're lying not only about the justification for including the question, but they're lying about the deadlines, and that should count against them in some way, shape, or form. And yet it's not entirely clear that it actually will. All right, we'll take a 2-minute break. I'm actually going to come back to this. Maybe we'll still read the transcript since we're so into nuance here. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with reading the Washington Post overview of what happened, and then maybe we'll just dive. The transcript's not that long, and some of the nuance, I think, is possibly lost. We might gain some insight into what's going on, and there are some great moments, actually, in the transcript, which are, not laugh out loud funny, but just a little bit interesting, and I thought we might share it. Let's see. We left off by saying that the Supreme Court had said that Ross deserved great deference in deciding how to run the census, but that his explanation was contrived. The ruling affirmed the lower court decision in which Furman, the New York judge, said the question could only be added by resolving its legal defects. It was unclear after the Supreme Court ruling whether there would be time, for the administration to come up with an acceptable justification to meet judicial muster. It's clear now that the answer is yes, there is time, which means they were lying when they said earlier that there wasn't. The New York judge, in his opinion, said overcoming that hurdle would require gathering adequate information and statistics, submitting a report to relevant congressional committees, and considering relevant evidence, as well as providing Ross's real rationale. Critics of which they weren't going to accomplish no matter what the time limit was, because Ross was never going to give you his real rationale. We already know it. It's written. It's just that Ross didn't write it. It's the rationale he accepted and moved forward with. Critics of the question say it is a partisan move intended to depress the response rate in immigrant communities and could result in an undercount of millions of Hispanics who are more highly represented in Democratic areas. And that is something that that the transcript addresses in a slightly different way, too. It's really... we'll get to it because I think it's actually a pretty important clarification and statement of another of the incredible games that this administration is actually playing here. Data from the census, which every U.S. household is required to fill out, and remember that it's a requirement, is used by businesses and by the government to allocate hundreds of billions of dollars in federal spending per year, not just representation. Very important to point this out. It's also used to determine congressional apportionment and redistricting. The form has not included a question related to citizenship since 1950. Almost from the moment the Supreme Court ruled, Justice Department lawyers figured the administration would have no choice. The census would have to be printed without the citizenship question, people familiar with the matter said. That is because the deadline to print was just days away, and officials knew there would not be time to successfully push for some other outcome, according to the people, who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the administration's deliberations. somewhere in here, and I don't know if I pocketed it or did I pocket it and then archive it. That is a question. But I thought I saw at the time, a relatively convincing tweet, if I'm not mistaken, from Adam Bonin. The point of which I think was to try and settle some frayed nerves about whether or not there really was an opening to, if not ignore the Supreme Court, then work around the ruling of the Supreme Court and get a question, a citizenship question, onto the census form after all. And he was, I'm pretty sure that I had seen it laid out, and I think I don't see it in the archive of it. It might still be in the now ever-growing pocket list, and makes it's growing so quickly it's difficult to find the things that are buried. I'll see if I can scroll. But I thought he was making a pretty decent argument as to why there it is. There would end up being no citizenship question. I'm curious to see if it is in fact related to the time limit. Adam had tweeted on June 27th, I guess right after the decision had been handed down. I think my colleagues who believe the citizenship question on the census can still be revived have it wrong. Well, in the end, he may still be right here. The court affirmed the district court's decision to remand this back to Commerce. So what did that remand, below, reprinted here, constitute? And this is a screen grab, I guess, of that remand. In these unusual circumstances, the district court was warranted in remanding to the agency, Commerce, and we affirm that disposition. We do not hold that the agency decision here was substantively invalid, but agencies must pursue their goals reasonably. Reasoned decision-making under the Administrative Procedures Act calls for an explanation for agency action. What was provided here was more of a distraction. Very interesting. The second of Adam's tweets here says, go to the district court's decision. On pages 266 and 270, Judge Furman explicitly held that that Commerce has never suggested there was an alternative valid reason for the citizenship question, despite a lengthy trial. And here, again, a screen grab. The parties' respective arguments for an alternative remedy are unpersuasive. For their part, defendants, that'd be the government here, contend that remand without vacatur, I know they even pronounce it vacatur. It's without vacating the decision. I can't remember the actual law school pronunciation of things. It's too many years here. But, all right, so defendants contend that remand without vacating the case is the only potentially appropriate remedy. Putting aside whether such a remedy is consistent with the plain language of the Administrative Procedure Act, it is inappropriate here. Courts authorizing remand without vacatur have done so when the agency shows at least a serious possibility that it will be able to substantiate its decision on remand, and that the consequences of vacating might be quite disruptive. Defendants have done neither here. The problem with Secretary Ross's decision was not that it was inadequately explained, but rather that it was substantively arbitrary and capricious. How many times have I hit you with that one? Not that it was arbitrary and capricious and, quote, not in accordance with statutes that constrain his discretion. And here Adam highlights it. And as plaintiffs correctly point out, the Secretary has never suggested an alternative basis for his decision. Notably, defendants offer nothing more than a bare conclusory assertion that there is a non-trivial likelihood that the agency will be able to state a valid legal basis for its decision on remand. Again highlighted, nothing in either the administrative record of the trial even remotely suggests such a likelihood. So they're actually pretty clear on it, and I can see why Adam comes to this decision. So his third tweet reads, so the sole purpose of ordering a remand here was to hand the census back to the Commerce Department within the confines of the court's orders, not to give them a second bite at the justification apple, and it's that order which the Supreme Court affirmed. Again, here the screen grab that says, by analogy to appellate litigation, a remand is arguably necessary to restore an agency's jurisdiction where an adjudicatory decision or formal rulemaking was under review. Here, by contrast, Secretary Ross's jurisdiction over the 2020 census has presumably continued unabated throughout this litigation, and his ongoing obligation to execute his statutory duties with respect to the census will survive whatever remedy the court orders. Put differently, it's hard to see how the court's decision whether or not to remand in these cases would affect the Secretary's ongoing statutory authority over the form and content of the census questionnaire. Having said all that, and if only to avoid confusion, the court will remand the case to the extent that such an order is necessary to restore the Secretary's jurisdiction over the census questionnaire. It goes without saying that such remand is limited to further action not inconsistent with the court's orders. Anyway, it's a long way. I guess I'm uncertain that Adam's really discussing the time limit, although the time limit certainly plays into it, and they should be held to their insistence that there was a time limit. But I guess his focus is more on the question that, or the fact that the court seems unconvinced that there could possibly be an explanation that's better than the one they gave, which was legally inadequate and arbitrary and capricious on top of it all. And as they say, not in accordance with statutes that constrain the Secretary's discretion in all of this. Plus the fact that, at no point during any of the proceedings did they ever suggest that there was an alternative. And to be at this late date after the Supreme Court has already decided on the thing to say, well, we just thought of, not even that we just thought of a new explanation, but that we just thought of the fact that we need to think of a new alternative explanation. And I can't believe that they would jump out of the way for an alternative explanation given how much lying they did about the deadlines. Anyway, just wanted to kind of clarify that in my own head, what Adam had been talking about. Returning now to the Washington Post's overview of all of this stuff, when Trump tweeted later that day that he had asked his lawyers about delaying the census, Justice Department lawyers were mystified, the People said. Doing so, in their view, would be illegal, except that there's no remedy for it. But the White House asked the Justice Department to explore that option and others that might allow the question to be added, which, by the way, delaying the census not only raises questions of whether or not that's constitutional, but again, it pulls the rug out from under all of the Justice Department's arguments that hinged upon there being this July 1st deadline. That's bad news for the lawyers who have to appear. Anyway, they quickly told the White House that it wasn't realistic or tenable given the time constraints and what the Supreme Court said. One person familiar with the matter said, "That's our job to say it's not going to work. That's why it's not going to work," the person said. He's allowed to ask the question. Trump is, I guess, and that's really all there is to it. Even as Trump continued to talk publicly about the issue, officials at the Commerce Department proceeded as they thought they had to, by printing the census without the citizenship question. At some point between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, though, the landscape shifted dramatically, because Trump's crazy and an idiot. Trump tweeted Tuesday night that he had, quote, asked the Department of Commerce and the Department of Justice to do whatever is necessary to bring this most vital of questions and this very important case to a successful conclusion. The next morning, he sent the more forceful tweet. By then, Justice Department officials were scrambling to implement a directive to reverse course and find a way to put the citizenship question back on the census, knowing it could be both practically and legally impossible, people familiar with the matter said. As of 6:30 p.m. Wednesday, 2020 census forms were still being printed, probably very slowly. Without the citizenship question, a person familiar with the matter said, although, by the way, can I just point this out? Maybe they're not being printed. How the hell do you know they're being printed? Because census officials said they were? What if they're just lying? They were lying about the deadline, so why aren't they lying about this? Show me those forms that are being printed. I'd love to see them. Has anyone seen them? Anyone snapped a photo of them to share them? Justice Department officials, meanwhile, were looking for a way to abate the Supreme Court's concern and include the question on that census, the person said. The person declined to say what those options might be or how the question might be included, given forms are already being printed, maybe. Conservative radio host and former administration lawyer Hugh Hewitt wrote on Twitter that a new executive order from Trump to his Commerce Secretary directing him to add such questions for particular reasons would render moot the prior dispute, that's a nice rhyme, and perhaps allow for the question to be added. A White House official confirmed Wednesday evening that the presses are running on the forms without the question. How slowly, we don't know. Or if they're lying, we don't know. And a second government official confirmed it, which just means there are two lying. A Justice Department spokeswoman declined to comment. The Commerce Department did not respond to requests for comment Wednesday. A Trump advisor who regularly speaks to the president said Trump was frustrated after government lawyers determined there was no way to win the case and released statements yesterday saying the battle was over. The advisor said Attorney General William P. Barr had agreed and recently confirmed this to the president. So everybody's fired. One senior administration official said the fracas is, people like to say it's fracas, yeah? Said is likely to further depress the standing of Ross, who's asleep, if not dead himself, who has somewhat regularly drawn the president's ire. It could also be a test for Barr's relationship with the president, though Trump usually effusively praises Barr, this official said. Why even bother pointing that out? It'll turn on you in a second. In the Supreme Court's splintered ruling, which really should have been more unanimous, Roberts wrote that federal agencies must offer genuine justifications for important decisions, reasons that can be scrutinized by courts and the interested public. He was joined by the court's 4 liberal justices. He was dissented from by 4 judges who said the government shouldn't have to explain anything to anybody. They just do what they want to do. Because they're for small government, you see. Originalists, if you will. Opponents of the question said they worry the latest reversal could have the effect of further scaring immigrants away from filling out the form, even if it ultimately doesn't include the question. This administration's flagrant disregard of court orders is appalling and will result in the same kind of misinformation that leads our communities to be reluctant to participate in the census at a time when the Census Bureau should be actively encouraging everyone's full participation. Denise Hewlett, the National Senior Counsel at Moldoff and a lead attorney in the Maryland trial, said in a statement. Yes, and that gets to the point that maybe will only be explained by taking a look at the transcript of the phone conference, which I have in front of me and is not all that long. The players in this are the plaintiffs. Robin Kravitz is the plaintiff who filed the suit, and along with others, and then La Unión del Pueblo Entero, or Lupe, L-U-P-E for short, both suing the Department of Commerce here. And the Kravitz plaintiffs are listed here: Benjamin Duke and Shankar Duraiswamy, I guess is my best guess at his pronunciation there. The Lupe plaintiffs represented, as we said just a moment ago, by Denise Hewlett. And for the defendants, that would be the government: Joshua Gardner of the DOJ, Stephen Ehrlich of DOJ, but I don't think he speaks. And then later on, in chimes, is it Hunt, the Assistant Attorney General. So here's how the whole thing goes. The court, that is the judge, starts off with, it's a phone call, remember. Good afternoon. Who do I have for the Lupe plaintiffs? They clarify all of this. We'll skip this part. Hewlett and Duke and others chiming in here. Josh Gardner and Jody Hunt are on the call for Assistant Attorney General Joe. It says Jody. I guess they know him as Joe, but Jody Hunt for the government. Okay, so the judge starts out. Mr. Gardner, who is there for the DOJ. Mr. Gardner, Josh Gardner, I know you're on vacation, and so I hate to disrupt that. Couple things. One, we do have a court reporter here. It's Ms. Davis, who knows each of your voices well at this point. So anyway, he goes on to say, you don't have to identify yourself every time you speak. She knows who's talking at this point. So I guess the reason I wanted to have this call, obviously, we had our call, I guess it was yesterday. Feels like a while ago. Even he feels the same thing. But I think it was just yesterday. And then this morning I saw a tweet that got my attention. I don't know how many federal judges have Twitter accounts, but I happen to be one of them, and I follow the president, and so I saw a tweet that directly contradicted the position that Mr. Gardner had shared with me yesterday. He's pretty good at playing, if not passive-aggressive. He's keeping his feelings in check here. I'll say in that regard, I had felt somewhat bad about not just immediately accepting Mr. Gardner's representation and sort of taking some measures to try and pin it down. What the judge is saying here is, I felt bad pressing the government attorney here who said, yes, Your Honor, the current position of the Justice Department is that they will be dropping the question. They're going to print the questionnaires without the question. And I didn't just say, okay, thank you very much, we'll write that down, and that'll be the position of the government. I actually know by now that the Trump administration is kind of full of liars. And I wanted some assurances that you weren't just BSing the court. And I pressed you about it, and I felt a little bit bad about that because you've been pretty honest with the court, but your bosses haven't been. And I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask for some proof that what you were saying wasn't just crap. But he goes on to say, I think I even indicated yesterday, and I'll indicate again today, that Mr. Gardner and every government attorney who has appeared in this case has been nothing but professional and candid with the court. And so my attempts to pin him down yesterday were not any sort of reflection on him or what I think of his candor. But then the tweet that I saw, which I suspect we all know the tweet I'm referring to, then caused me to think I hadn't gone far enough in terms of pinning the government down on where things stand. In other words, basically the judge here is saying he's right where I am, if you now represent to me that the government is printing the forms without the question, I ask how slowly, and are you sure, and can I see them? And how many of them do you intend to print? And is the game plan to print 10 slowly over the course of the next 10 days and then print millions with the question? I actually literally have to ask this. Things that used to be ridiculous, that you would end up impeaching a judge for being so biased as to ask things like this, I now have to ask because that's the administration we're dealing with. So now he thinks I didn't go far enough in pinning down the government, and clearly he's right. So now we have a court reporter here. I'm going to ask, frankly, the same question I asked yesterday to Mr. Gardner. Is the government going to continue efforts to place a citizenship question on the 2020 census? Mr. Gardner now speaks up. And he says, after saying, this is Mr. Gardner, I want to back up just a step and say that I've been with the United States Department of Justice for 16 years through multiple administrations, and I've always endeavored to be as candid as possible with the court. You have to be, right? What I told the court yesterday was absolutely my best understanding of the state of affairs and apparently also the Commerce Department's state of affairs, because you probably saw Secretary Ross issued a statement very similar to what I told the court. The tweet this morning was the first I had heard of the president's position on this issue, just like the plaintiffs in Your Honor. I do not have a deeper understanding of what that means at this juncture, other than what the president has tweeted. But obviously, as you can imagine, I'm doing my absolute best to figure out what's going on. I can tell you that I have confirmed that the Census Bureau is continuing with the process of printing the questionnaire without the citizenship question, and that process has not stopped. What does that even mean, process? I'm walking slowly towards the on button of the printing press that's processed. The court says, all right, I'll hear from either plaintiff's counsel, Mr. Dureswamy. I'm hoping I'm not mangling that too bad. I'll start with you if you have any comments. And he says, Your Honor, I think it underscores, obviously, the need for a stipulated order, as we talked about yesterday, that makes clear not only that the government is printing the questionnaire for the 2020 census without a citizenship question, but that there will be no further effort to inquire about citizenship status as part of the 2020 census in any manner. We prepared a draft stipulated order that we're prepared to send to the government along those lines. I think it also suggests that we may need a further provision of that order that makes clear that the defendants will not communicate to the public anything to the contrary, suggesting that the 2020 census is inquiring about citizenship status, and further that they will publicly counter any such misinformation that comes from government officials. So we are working on a stipulated order to that effect. Given Mr. Gardner's own uncertainty, it's not clear to me if the government is saying we will continue with the process of working out the stipulated order, that they're prepared to move forward with that, or if they're saying that they need to revisit this. So are we clear on what he is asking? He is saying basically it's clarified later on in the transcript too by other plaintiffs' counsel. What they're saying is the administration is trying to have its cake and eat it too. And everyone knows that if you're working for Donald Trump, it's all about trying to eat as much cake as possible. Although no more cake eating is possible. He's dead. But what they're saying here, and they say later in the transcript, is even if the court ends up ordering that there be no such question, there's nothing stopping administration officials up to and including the President of the United States from publicly stating, all you Hispanics, watch out, because we're definitely going to be asking this question. You better not find yourself at home when the census takers come. Don't fill out the form. We're going to get you. And if we were to say this, but they're not asking that question. Everyone, please answer the census. We've been guaranteed that it's not on the forms. But it really is. I'm just kidding. Or am I? They're literally saying that the President of the United States is going to be playing the just kidding, or am I game? And that there needs to be something done about it. And unfortunately, in the rest of the transcript, the court says, I don't know if I can do that. I really don't. The court then continues, let me ask, before I get Ms. Hewlett's perspective, as to your second point that there should be some requirement that they not say anything to the contrary, what would be the authority? What would be the basis for me to issue that order? Obviously, if they're willing to stipulate, that is just simply agree to it. If you guys say, well, you will now agree that you won't say anything. Yes, we agree that. Obviously, if they're willing to stipulate to that in an order that they agree to, that's fine. But let's assume for the sake of argument that they're not. What would be the basis for me to order them not to? And I assume you're including the President of the United States in what you're suggesting. Not to make any statements contrary to the order that they're not going to include the question. He's asking, how can I, as a mere federal judge, order the silence of the President of the United States on some specific topic? And he's right. I don't know that he can. He can certainly attempt it. Just as the President is entitled to ask the question, the judge is entitled to issue that order, and it's entitled to review after that order, too. But he's now telling us that he finds himself at a totally different, but now, I guess, somehow related, constitutional crisis. How do I ensure the compliance of the President of the United States with the court's intention? And he's admitting, I don't think I can. And the lawyer answers, well, we've included in our complaint, he goes on to say, I've given you a draft order that stipulates it, which is to say, I really don't have any answer to that. I'm hoping that the government will simply sign this agreement whereby they tell the court that they will do just that and will correct any misinformation. And that presumably if we find them in out of compliance with the stipulation, they could be slapped with a contempt of court citation. But what do you do if it's the President himself who's violating the order? And the answer is, I don't know. And think about how much hinges on that. Think about what victories we were supposed to be celebrating on behalf of the Democratic House of Representatives for moving forward with their own case, or authorizing a case and not yet filing it, authorizing the filing of a case that would transfer the contempt power that they're looking to enforce here behind their subpoenas to a court. We want the court to find the government in contempt because no one believes in inherent contempt. Haven't filed that case. We've authorized that case. We'll see how it comes out. Maybe it wins, maybe it doesn't. But don't they come back to the same question? If it's the president himself who's defying the orders and ordering others to defy the orders, or playing the just kidding or am I game, what do we do? And the answer is, yeah, we don't know. So, did you think we didn't have a constitutional crisis brewing? We do. Happy 4th of July, everybody. Good thing the president's dead and won't see this thing come to fruition. Stay tuned now for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. Now that I've raised your spirits. Coming up next.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
This should be interesting. The fact that the major news media can now list all of the tells that Trump tells that show he's lying, it's very telling indeed. So stay tuned for an unraveling of that, plus much, much more from all around the country and indeed the world, coming up next.